So welcome to our talk. The talk today is it is mindfulness, awareness, attention, and presence. Was just going to call it presence, but as I explored into the nature of presence, I realized that there was a very strong overlap with mindfulness, and mindfulness has an overlap with awareness and attention. So I thought I'd better bring in all those terms. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about presence and mindfulness and awareness and attention firstly from a Theravada Buddhist perspective, and then I'd like to provide a Zen or a Chan Buddhist perspective on awakening and presence, because Chan and Zen sort of describe this same experience of awakening from a different angle. It's the same awakening, but it's sort of described from a different angle, and I think it's quite. I quite like the way they describe it. So I I first got introduced to Buddhism in 1975 when I was 19. And around that time, I got very interested in Tibetan Mahayana Buddhism. And I remember going to a retreat in Chen in Queensland, in Udalo, Queensland. And I don't know how many people there, lots of people, maybe hundreds or 100 or somewhere. I can't remember how many. We're all camping and squeezing into this gompa. And we're learning about Tibetan Buddhism, and it was really full on, Lam Rim and all sorts of things. And there was a book that was floating around. It was called Remember, Be Here Now by Ram Dass. And I thought it was really great. It was really quite simple. It had lots of diagrams and drawings and just simple things. And it seemed to me a kind of relief from, the stuff that I was learning with Tibetan Buddhism was fantastic. I mean, it was just amazing. But it was such a relief in many respects to realize that all you had to do is to remember to be here now, to remember to be present. And I continued with Buddhism, and eventually got interested in Theravada Buddhism, and then traveled to Thailand and to ordain as a Buddhist monk, and that's what I did for 2 years. And I remember the lessons that I learned from that book were really, really valuable. That remember just to be here now. In fact, if you can remember to be here now, everything is kind of resolved, because most of the problems I seem to have were about getting caught up in concepts about something else, or worries about the future, or regrets about the past, or ruminations about the past, and kind of not being present. That was when I was not being present, I was having lots of issues. But being present seemed to be a wonderful refuge. It was kind of grounding into reality of what's actually going on. And it was so very powerful for me. So I didn't really learn about mindfulness until I got interested in Theravada Buddhism, actually. And then I got very interested in mindfulness. And to me, it seemed as though the term mindfulness with remembering to be here now, or presence, seemed to be synonymous. And I think they are, though there's some slightly different ways of looking at it, as I mentioned earlier, in the differences between, say, Theravada Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. So I got interested in Buddhism, and I practiced, and I went to Thailand and was a monastic, and then I disrobed and came back to Australia. And I remember being on a retreat, and I think it was on a retreat, must have been in the early 80s. Yeah, must have been in the early 80s. Probably about 83 or 82 or something, 1982 or 1983. It was a retreat with Joseph Goldstein and I think it was Sharon Salzberg, or it might have been Alan Compence. I'm not sure of the other teacher right now. But there was a manager on that retreat, and the manager was someone by the name of John Hale, who, ended up being one of my mentors or teachers. Anyway, I was on this retreat and I was craving after something. I thought I really needed something. I was like some pens or paper or something. I can't remember what it was. And so I found John, and he was going to the shops, and so I asked him. I said, John, would you mind getting me some things? I need some medicine, or I need some herbs, or whatever it was. And I remember him taking out a pen and taking out a piece of paper and a notebook, and just mindfully writing the list down. And I was so impressed. I mean, it was just incredible. You could see this person was completely present for what he was doing. He was in the moment, completely in the moment, mindful. And I said, wow, you're really in the moment, aren't you? And John said to me, yes, it's really important. I feel it's really important to be present. So I've seen people who are present, and it's really impressionable. When I was in Thailand, I used to go for Pindapat in the mornings. It was, Pindapat is alms round, sorry. Pindapat, we used to travel from the temple I was in, which was up on a hill. It was called Wat Doi Dharma Jedi, and a doi is a little hill, and Dharma Jedi is like a stupa, and so there's the hill of the stupa. That's where we had our temple, and we used to walk to the village, probably about 3 or 4 kilometers away, maybe more. I can't remember. It was a nice long walk. It took us at least about 40 minutes, I think, and sometimes I used to kind of run and. Almost, you weren't allowed to run as a monk, but you could walk very quickly. But I remember we would all go down there and we'd wait for a Chan to come along, and then we'd form a line behind a Chan. And I remember often walking behind Achan Ben. Achan Ben was my teacher. I remember walking behind him, and he was just so present. It's like every footstep he was there for that. It was like this powerful being was being present to the earth for every step, just every step. I remember that was such an impression. And I think these impressions from people who are completely present are inspiring, and they've enabled me to have a model or someone to some particular way of relating to the world, myself, and time with presence. So it was really, really powerful. So, of course, I mentioned that mindfulness is often synonymous with presence, and I think it is. And the term in Buddhism that refers to mindfulness, of course, is sati. Sati literally means memory, remembering. And here, I think remembering plays an important part in being present and being mindful. So there is definitions of mindfulness. There's quite a few. The world is abound with definitions of mindfulness at the moment, especially since it's become popularized through contemporary culture. First of all, with psychology, and then through a whole range of different life areas. But one definition that I really like is by Bhikkhu Bodhi, and it's to remember to pay attention. So we hear the word remembering. To remember to pay attention to what is occurring in one's immediate experience with care and discernment. It's a really lovely way of describing mindfulness. And Alan Wallace also accesses the idea of memory in describing mindfulness. He talks about mindfulness as retrospective memory of things in the past, prospectively remembering to do something in the future, and present-centered recollection in the sense of maintaining unwavering attention to a present reality. Isn't that lovely? I mean, it's just such a beautiful way of describing this present. So it's not that you don't think about the future when you're present, but you're present when you're thinking about the future. And when you get to the future, you remember your aspirations. You remember what you're doing in the future. So there's this quality of remembering and presence and attention. And another definition, this is by Narada, of mindfulness, that is, calling back to mind or bearing in mind. Bearing in mind. So with mindfulness, we remember to be here now, just as it was described in that book by Ram Dass, and just as what I've found to be a very powerful refuge. You know, I've been practicing in Buddhist practices for, I don't know, now 47 years, I think. How old? No, 47 years, 48 years maybe. From 1975, how long ago? That's 47 years. So 47 years, my refuge has been to be present. It is something that stabilizes me. And I even noticed it even in the last week, whenever I've noticed that I get anxious about something, and I'm worrying about something, and thinking about this, and how am I going to fit that in? And then if I can just breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, and go, just this, Malcolm, just here now, just be present. Walk up and down the aisleway, walk up and down, backwards and forwards in your house looking for what you lost, in a way that Chan Buddhist used to walk. Present. Remember to, make the list for your tasks like John Hale would make lists for tasks. Present. So it is really a refuge. So other aspects of presence and mindfulness, well, I should say more of mindfulness, are attention and awareness. And awareness here doesn't mean just the function of mind as awareness, as being opposed to unconscious. Like, if we're not unconscious, we are aware. It's a function of the mind. But in this case, the relationship to mindfulness is that we are aware that we are aware. And a few weeks ago, I listened to my friend Patrick Carney, my friend and colleague and fellow meditator and sometimes teacher, came to Lismore, came to our country, and he stayed the night at my place actually, and I went up and listened to a talk that he gave up at the Kuan Yin Center. And his talk was about receptive awareness and directed awareness. It was really a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed listening to it. And Patrick made the point that the function of the mind is to be aware or conscious. And we are aware as long as we are not conscious. So, but at the basic level, it doesn't relate to what we're talking about with mindfulness. Someone could be almost, what do they call that when you drink so much alcohol that you pass out? I can't remember. One could be on the brink of that and still be aware, but I would hesitate. I would be very reluctant to say that they're mindful. So when we are mindful, we are aware that we are aware. We are remembering that we are aware of whatever we are aware of. And in that way, we are mindful. Does that make sense? Yeah. And a teacher from Myanmar teaches something called receptive awareness. And this equates to just recognizing that we are aware in this moment. Like right now, I could ask you, can you just recollect or recognize that you are aware. And that's the practice. It's as simple as that. Because most times we are caught up in something that's not present. Most times we are caught up in, what we've got to do tomorrow, or, what we haven't done today, or, the projects we're involved in. I tend to get caught up in my projects. And they're professional projects, actually. So I'm not justifying them any more than any other projects, but they're my livelihood. Like I need to write a report, or I need to do my BAS, or whatever it is. I often get caught up in that and lost in those activities. But if I can remember to be aware of what I'm doing in this moment, because there's no other moment, then I have a level of freedom. So what I see Patrick describes as receptive awareness is this like a peripheral awareness. And it is wide and broad and takes in the context of experience. Peripheral awareness, as far as I can see it, is taking in the big picture of things. But when Patrick talked about directed awareness, it involved a particular focusing on a particular object within our wide awareness. So I would say that receptive awareness is like peripheral awareness. It's kind of broad and open. But directed awareness, as Patrick described it in the talk that he gave, I would call attention. Attention. And in meditation, we can use our attention to focus on a particular object to discern its nuances, to discern its features, to see, the way it changes, for example, or to see its not self nature, or to see its suffering nature, or its dukkha nature. We can use attention in a specific way to focus on the nature of the object and understand the nature of the object that we're focusing on. So attention allows us to filter out information and sensations, perceptions that are not relevant or important for us at that moment. This is just in meditation, but also in life, actually. Neuroscience will talk about attention as being able to focus out the many objects that come into our awareness. There's just so much information out there, coming through the senses, that it's overwhelming. So we need attention to be able to focus out all that stimuli and be able to do what we need to do in life based on our attention and our direction. So with attention, we focus our mental energies on what is important and relevant. And when we can focus on one thing and tune out other things, it can alter our perceptions, and it can enhance understanding. Culadasa is one of, I've read a wonderful book by Culadasa, listened to a couple of talks. He's great. I really like his book. He wrote a book called The Mind Illuminated. I've just got it up there on my shelf. And I read it on a retreat. I just read that on a retreat, a 2-month retreat, and I just followed, it was actually 5 weeks, sorry. I followed his instructions to the letter. It was fantastic. But Culadasa says that conscious experience involves both attention and awareness. And these two ways of becoming conscious of experience can be differentiated. And that's the same as what I've been saying. Attention involves focusing, and it dominates our conscious experience, whereas awareness, which he calls peripheral awareness, is more in the background. And in order to clarify the differences between attention and peripheral awareness, in his book, he referred to the field of visual stimuli. And, you're looking at a screen right now. I think most of you are looking at a screen. So awareness here would be like not only seeing the screen, but also being aware of what's in the peripheral of your spheres. Like I'm looking at the screen, I'm looking at, one of you, and I'm recognizing who you are and so on. But at the same time, my visual focus is on one of you, a picture of one of you. But in my peripheral awareness, I'm aware that there's a door over there, and there's trees out there, and my dog's sitting on the mat outside the door at the moment. So I've got peripheral awareness, but what's important for me is what is in my focus. So that which is in the focus is what we call attention. I'm attending to that. What's in the peripheral is important, and if I need to bring attention to it, I will. Like, for example, sometimes my attention is grabbed. My dog might start barking, and my attention will be grabbed, and I might need to turn towards it, and I turn towards the dog barking and tell him to stop barking, which won't work because dogs don't do that. Sometimes you can growl at them and that's enough. We usually thank him and tell him thanks very much for letting us know about that bird up the back, or thanks very much for letting us know about the wallaby. It's all good. It's under control. Thanks a lot. So, but what I'm saying is peripheral awareness is important because it can indicate what we might need to pay attention to and focus on. So, and with awareness, we might hear something in the background, but if we're meditating, we can discern about it. Like with peripheral awareness, I might hear my dog barking, for example, but I can just note to myself, oh, that's just in the background. That's just something I'm aware of. I'll choose not to attend to it because this is what I've chosen to attend to. I'm chosen to attend to giving you a Dharma talk, or if I'm meditating, I'm chosen to attend to the sensations at the tip of my nose, for example. So it's really useful to be able to recognize that awareness and attention are both present in our meditations, and we can shift backwards and forwards with them, and we can use awareness to help us be aware of things we may need to pay attention to. A classic example here is that I might have chosen to attend to my breath at the nose tip, and then in the peripheral of my awareness, I'm aware of the emerging of a particular hindrance. I might have some thoughts about something that I don't really like, or I might have frustration with something emerging, bubbling up. My awareness can indicate, there's a hindrance there, and I can choose to leave it behind and not attend to it. Attend to it enough just to deal with it, but not attend to it enough where it disturbs what I'm actually doing. Can you understand the use of attention and awareness here? They're both really important in meditation. As far as attention can go, we can have wise attention or unwise attention. And I've given you talks about this. Wise attention allows us to nourish the good. And with unwise attention, unfortunately, we feed into the unwholesome. With wise attention, we can discern the characteristics of experience and the interdependence of them, and awareness can alert us to when we may need to bring attention to what we may need to bring attention to, such as the hindrances. So with wise and unwise attention, it's useful to nourish wise attention, and it's useful to restrain and manage unwise attention. I've talked about this before. unwise attention would be, for example, me hearing the dog bark. It grabs my attention and I start to think, that bloody dog, it never shuts up, blah, 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 blah. I wish he'd go away, or whatever it is. I'm attending to it in an unwise way. I'm fueling my greed, ignorance, and hatred. In this particular case, I'm fueling my aversion. If, however, I pay attention to it in a wise way, I can attend to that barking dog, well, bhakti, recognize that it's just a barking dog. It doesn't need to dominate my state of mind. It's going to be impermanent. It's just my dog doing his job. And I can attend to it in a way where it is wise. So it nourishes a wholesome response, and it nourishes wisdom. So mindfulness conveys this sense of presence. As with mindfulness, we can only be here now. And presence, I think, is probably best described as being here now. And Bhikkhu Bodhi has also described mindfulness as presence of mind. And according to Analayo, mindfulness, he's described mindfulness in this way, as soft, awake presence. That's nice, isn't it? Soft, awake presence. I mean, Analayo talks about it as, he personifies it actually. He talks about mindfulness as his friend, gives it a gender, a feminine gender, because it is receptive and open and present for him, and benevolent, in fact. It's something that's there and supporting him and helping him. It's his friend. Of mindfulness, Analayo also describes it with the acronym PEARL. Now, PEARL, this acronym refers to 1, P, protective, E, embodied, A, attentive, R, receptive, and L, liberating. So, mindfulness protects us from falling into unwholesome patterns. In the sutras, it's been described as like being a guard at a city gate. And mindfulness chooses, the city gate, the guard chooses who to let in and who not to let in. So with mindfulness, we can choose to let in or not let in various patterns or tendencies or habits. We can choose with our discernment to let in the wholesome, and we can choose not to nourish and feed or let in the unwholesome. E, embodied. Mindfulness is embodied, and I think this is where the presence comes with it. Embodied because it's not dissociated and it's not intellectual. It's embodied. It's completely in our being. It's about our being rather than just thinking about things. I remember when I first started teaching mindfulness to the general public. Well, I'm not even then, even up until now, these days as well. Often people will talk about mindfulness. Well, you say, be mindful of a sound, for example, and they say, "Oh, you mean I've got to think about it?" And I say, no, it's not about thinking about it. It's about being present with it, being open and receptive to the sound, and seeing it for what it is. You're seeing it for what it is. So embodied is this other aspect of mindfulness, which is the way it is, which describes our presence in it. Attentive, as I've described before, PEA, attentive. It involves attention. Not always attention. Sometimes we can more turn towards just this receptive awareness. But there are times when we are attentive. It's this going backwards and forwards between awareness and attention with a mindfulness practice. Receptive. Receptive is interesting. This is another element of mindfulness. Some ways mindfulness has been described in the texts and by various teachers is by coming face to face with experience. Like, it's confronting. When we have something terrible happening in our lives, or when the situation is difficult, we have a tendency to turn away from it. Whereas mindfulness, the tendency is to turn towards it and to not challenge it, but come face to face with the experience. So receptive here means turning towards it, and rather than aggressively struggling with it, we are open and receptive to the experience. We are present, we are open. We're seeing it for what it is. We're accepting it in many respects. When we understand the term acceptance means willingness to be with experience, it doesn't mean necessarily agreeing with experience, but it's a willingness to be with experience, whether it's unpleasant or pleasant. So receptive, this is this other element of mindfulness. And it is soft and open. I remember there's been times when I've been practicing meditation and you take on this attitude that you're going to war. I mean, some of the Asian teachers talk about it as going to war. It's like going to war. The enemy is the kilesa. Kilesa is the defilements, and you go to war. It's a battle. And sometimes I've had that attitude. I'm going to sit with her. Kind of aggressive. I'm going to pounce on these experiences and see them for impermanent and so on. But it is actually, it's not a very helpful approach in my view. I mean, I think it's helpful to be courageous and brave and turn towards experience, but it's most helpful to turn towards experience in a soft and open way, because that indicates to me the opposite of aversion, which is, warm benevolence. It's a soft and open presence with experience that helps them be transformed. So the last of the pearl analogy is liberating. It's liberating because it frees us from cycles. Mindfulness, it helps short circuit reactive cycles. I've talked about this many times as well. Excuse me. This goes into many different ways. There's many different systems within the Buddhist teachings that have mindfulness as a key factor. Mindfulness is the seventh factor on the Eightfold Path. For example, we have right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. It's key. The Eightfold Path is, of course, ethical foundations or lifestyles, giving rise to the capacity to cultivate our mind, giving us the composure and the conscience and the clear conscience and the integrity and the sense of sense of being free, ethically, to be able to cultivate our mind with concentration and mindfulness and energy. And so what we have with the Eightfold Path is ethics, being the right speech, right action, right livelihood. Meditation, there's three groups: ethics, meditation, which is energy, mindfulness and concentration, and the last component is wisdom. Actually, it's usually described as the first component, but it kind of goes in this way. It's like you cultivate ethics, have an ethical background, you have a ethical foundation, then you have the cultivation of your mind, and that gives rise to wisdom, which in the Eightfold Path is right view, right intentions. So this is described as a wheel that turns in the direction of liberation. So you see something's happening, you have right view, you make a firm intention that you're going to do something about it, right intention, then you act in accordance with your right vision or right insight and your intentions, your good intentions, that's speech, action and livelihood. And then you have that foundation and the stability and the composure to cultivate your mind. And it sort of goes in a circle, goes in like a wheel rolling towards liberation. Mindfulness is also in what we call the five powers, or the five faculties. There are five faculties, and then they transform to powers. The five faculties are faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. They all work together. Mindfulness is really important in balancing these factors so that they remain as power. They become powers rather than distorted perceptions, distorted perspectives on things. Like sometimes we can have too much wisdom without enough faith or confidence. And sometimes we can have too much concentration without enough energy. So the way these faculties are balanced is with mindfulness. And mindfulness is, of course, the first of the 7 factors of awakening. The 7 factors of awakening being mindfulness, curiosity or interest or investigation of dharmas, energy or effort, joy or piety or rapture, tranquility, concentration or samadhi, and then equanimity. Mindfulness is really key because it begins with mindfulness. It begins with this awareness. It begins with being present for experience. And then that leads to investigation, which leads to energy, which leads to joy, which leads to tranquility, concentration, and then it culminates in equanimity. So I think mindfulness is probably one of the most important factors in Buddhism, in Buddhist practice. Although it is, in the Eightfold Path, it is just as important as all the other factors. What I mean by that is that it's no more important than right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, and right concentration. So I mentioned earlier that I practiced in Tibetan Mahayana Buddhist approaches, and I've also practiced in Zen Mahayana approaches. And most of my practice is with the early Buddhism of the Theravada schools. There's something I've noticed that's different between these various approaches, the Mahayana and the Theravada, for example. And that with the early Buddhist approach, the angle that they take, or we take, is about cultivating or bringing something into being. The whole term for meditation, for example, is bhavana, and it refers to bringing into being or cultivating. And what we bring into being is insight and serenity. And what we bring into being is this insight, which is a component of wisdom, that was not there previously. So it's this bringing forth. It's about cultivating. What I noticed with the, and it's all, sorry, coming back, Theravada Buddhism is all about letting go of something, like letting go of craving, clinging, grasping, letting go of aversion, and cultivating wisdom. And with Mahayana, however, it's more about waking up to what's already there, which is really interesting. It's a different perspective. And in Tibetan Buddhism, the word for meditation is gom, which refers to familiarization, like we become familiar with the awakened state, for example, or we become familiar with various states of mind. We become familiar with ourselves. We become familiar with our hindrances. So both these perspectives, from the early Buddhist stuff, it's about cultivating, and from the later developments with the Mahayana approaches, including Zen, it is about waking up to what's already there. And they talk about waking up to our Buddha nature, waking up to the absolute, for example. And earlier this year, I attended an online retreat with Chan Master Gyalgo and Venerable Analayo. Analayo both of them were talking about emptiness practices, and Analayo came from the early Buddhist perspective, and Venerable Gyalgo came from a Chan Buddhist perspective. Chan Buddhism comes out of China. And he talked, Master Gyalgo, in his presentation and explanation of this approach, he talked about how Buddhism has three paths. Like in the developments of Buddhism, there's been three paths. With early Buddhism, he talked about it as the path of abandonment. Just like I mentioned earlier, it's about letting go of greed, ignorance, and hatred. It's about cultivation. The second path he talked about was the path of transformation. And as far as I understand this, it's like we use the energy of dukkha to transform to liberation. It's like understanding mud to lotuses. And it's also understood by how this mud to lotus transformation is demonstrated in the Four Noble Truths, or dukkha, cause of dukkha, freedom from dukkha, cessation of dukkha, and the way to be free. It can also be understood in terms of that yin-yang sign, where there's a constant transformation. Something comes to an end, and it transforms to its opposites. It's sort of this cycle of going round and round. So that was the second path of transformation. That was the second feature of the developments of the Buddhism. And the third development he called the path of recognition. And this is where he brought in the teachings of Chan Buddhism. And that is, we recognize our true nature as awakened. We recognize it. And this awakened nature, we recognize the absolute. It is prior to our awareness being colored by the taints and poisons of greed, delusion, and hatred. It is prior to conceptualizing about things. It is coming back to the source. They would describe it as the source of knowing, which is the awareness of the Buddha, our own Buddha awakened, our own Buddha nature. So when he said that there was changes because as Buddhism came from India and moved into Chinese culture, it was a whole different culture, a whole different way of seeing things and being in the world. And he talked about Chinese culture as being life-affirming rather than life-negating, which may have been, might be indicated in, say, early Buddhist teachings. That's to clarify that the Buddha didn't talk about nihilism, by the way, but he may have talked about not self, whereas in Chan Buddhism they'll talk about not self in a different way. They'll talk about it as no mind, for example. And as far as being here now there was an emphasis on being. This is in the Chan Buddhism. So the aim of Chan Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, because Zen comes from Chan. You can hear that term. The term Chan comes from the word jhana. Jhana means a highly concentrated state. So come across from India to China, the word turned to Chan, and then from China to Japan turned to Zen. See how that change occurred. So the aim of Zen practice is to awaken to the unconditioned, to realize Nibbana. Another ways of describing this is waking up to our true nature and being in the realm of the unconditioned, of the absolute, which is the unconditioned. So I remember I've just recently begun reading quite a bit about Zen Buddhism, and I've got this book called Trust and Awakening, which is by Stephen Snyder, and I'm doing some things with him at the moment. It's very interesting because he's coming from a very different angle. But I really appreciate what he's talking about and what he's guiding us into. So Stephen Snyder uses the term absolute, and I'm going to quote from him here, to convey it is an inclusive reality that has no conditions or conceptual partitions. It is not born and does not die. Thus, it is unconditioned. And, more importantly, it is always present and available in this moment, in every moment. Contacting and abiding in the absolute realm allows our consciousness to rest in a unified field of deep, all-accepting love, deep presence, and profound warmth that welcomes us home. In a theistic religion, the absolute realm would be equivalent to God. It is the animating source of all life with complete, unconditioned, unending, welcoming acceptance. This is a bit different. It's a bit different than what we hear in Theravada Buddhism, in early Buddhist stuff. I'm still kind of getting used to this language, but it is what they talk about with the absolute and in terms of being. So as far as I understand, the absolute from this Zen perspective, or this Chan perspective, has both unmanifest and manifest. Okay, so the Nibbana, or what we understand as freedom, is an unmanifest aspect of the absolute. So with Nibbana, there is no cause for dukkha, so therefore we have no dukkha. It is freedom from causes. It is empty of dukkha. It is also empty of materiality. And with that, with Nibbana and with meditation, we will talk about cessation. Cessation is a key factor just before awakening. Or it can be awakening. And it's the cessation of craving. And sometimes it's described as the cessation of consciousness. And it's the cessation of dukkha as well. So, the manifest of the absolute, on the other hand, could be its expression as being. According to Snyder, the manifest side of the absolute realm contains a nearly blinding brightness of pure unconditional love, innate goodness, pure presence, beingness, and pure awareness. So this gets kind of interesting. And I'm just quoting from this book. According to Snyder, absence is a synonym for emptiness in Buddhism. And I've talked about emptiness. I've given retreats on emptiness, and I've called it absence as well. And he's going on to say, it is a quality of reality where there is nothing apparent to ordinary perception, yet something substantial and significant is present and perceived intuitively directly through experiential contact. So there you go. Presence, on the other hand, is the opposite of that. Absence is the unmanifest. Presence is the manifest. And presence, on the other hand, is experiential contact with the beingness quality of this present moment. You get that? Anyway, so the way I understand it is that when we are awake and we live as awakened ones, we still eat and shit, we relate, we go to Woolworths, we pay the bills, we do our best statements, we have relationships, we vote for governments, and we are in the world. But we are not of the world. We no longer get caught up in the fictitious creations of our self-identity. And our view of believing our stories about the world and our identity. Rather, we are presently and completely just here, just now, just this, not getting sucked into conceptual realities and present with life as it is before we conceptualize about it. So early this morning I talked about silent illumination. I also talked about silent samadhi as that practice where we are present. We are just completely present with the experience, and we're not engaging with the concepts about the world. We're extremely habitualized to engage in concepts, to engage in signs of things. It's just the way it is. I mean, we've been conditioned to get caught up in this reality, and we need to function like that, to pay the bills, to go to Woolworths, to eat and shit and all the rest of it. But that comes at a cost, and the cost is that we also get caught up in the dukkha of all that. We're living in a fantasy or a conceptualized realm, which is just our concepts. It's just our mind-made realm. It's not really the way things are. Many of you remember the talk I gave on choosing the red pill with the Matrix. It's like that. So when we are present, we are free. When we are present for life and in the world, but are not bound by the world, we are liberated. So thank you very much for your attention and your presence and your awareness and your mindfulness. And I trust that this talk has been helpful. And let's be present for a few moments in silence.